Dozens of people in Armenia have been arrested this week after protesters blocked streets throughout the capital, Yerevan. Demonstrators have one demand: that Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan resign. The embattled leader, who stepped down 3 years ago over similar mass protests, is under fire at home over his plan to make peace with longtime rival Azerbaijan. At the heart of protesters' anger is the Armenian government's decision to return 4 border villages to Baku. Zeynep Gökçe has the details.
Thousands of Armenians gathered in the capital Yerevan to call for the removal of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. This comes after last month's announcement that Armenia and Azerbaijan would begin demarcating their borders in an effort to end decades of territorial disputes. The protesters are against what Pashinyan believes is a necessary step to avoid a new conflagration with Baku. After Azerbaijan managed to liberate most of Karabakh during a war in 2020, which ended with a Russian-brokered peace agreement, another round of fighting last September marked Baku gaining full sovereignty in the occupied region. Since then, the two South Caucasus rivals have been trying to forge a peace deal, with the latest talks taking place in Astana. Yerevan seems to be distancing itself from longtime supporter Moscow, accusing Russian peacekeepers deployed to Karabakh of failing to intervene during the clashes. On Thursday last week, Pashinyan and Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that the Kremlin would withdraw its troops from several regions of Armenia. Under Pashinyan's leadership, Armenia has pivoted towards the west by holding joint drills with US forces and even hinting it could one day apply for EU membership. And now, with Pashinyan saying he's ready to return to Azerbaijan 4 of its villages on the border, opponents argue these areas are also strategically important for landlocked Armenia for multiple reasons, including for its foreign trade and advantageous military positions. For an opposition member who was at last month's protests, giving up these territories can only happen in one way.
This process can be conducted under one condition: when the people stand for it. The issue of changing borders must be put to a referendum, and not one person deciding what to do.
But Pashinyan says he's determined to sign a peace agreement by November. In 2021, protesters had also demanded he step down for mismanaging the war with Azerbaijan, and he did, only to win a snap election in the same year. But if the protests continue, what will he do this time? Zeynep Gökçe, Strait Talk.
And to discuss the latest protests in Armenia, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Eugene Chausovsky. He is a Senior Director of Analytical Development and Training at Newslines Institute. And from Yerevan, Richard Giragosian. He is the Director of the Regional Studies Center. Hello and welcome to Strait Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Richard, could you walk us through what's been happening in Armenia? What's the latest? Have things calmed down?
Well, what we see is a wave of demonstrations and protests against the government, largely triggered by last month's breakthrough agreement with Azerbaijan over border demarcation and delineation. This is rather significant, but it's also both natural and normal, reflecting public disaffection and dissent. However, it is not yet a serious challenge to the Armenian government. Given Prime Minister Pashinyan of Armenia's re-election, despite losing the war of 2020, there is a degree of both legitimacy and stability, where the opposition remains vocal, but rather marginalized, given the lack of any alternative strategy. And negotiations with Azerbaijan are now progressing.
So, Eugene, as Richard mentioned, one of the reasons of these protests is a demarcation deal that foresees a return of 4 border villages that were part of Azerbaijan when the two countries were republics of the Soviet Union. So how big of a deal is this?
Well, I think, as Richard mentioned, this is something that can be expected to create some public backlash. Obviously, no country wants to give up territory that it holds, but I do think that this is a expected and normal part of the broader peace negotiations. There's going to have to be some difficult compromises. I think we've seen some challenges both internally in Armenia in terms of these protests, but also some external reactions and Armenia's difficult relationship with countries like Russia. But overall, it does seem that the peace negotiations, despite the setbacks and the ups and downs, are overall progressing.
So, Richard, what's the strategic importance of these villages? I mean, what do both parties stand to gain from this very agreement, especially when it comes to Armenia?
Well, first, let me start with the negative aspects. This was very much a unilateral concession by Armenia to Azerbaijan, and it only pertains to between 10 and 12 kilometers of the northern border. However, in a positive note, this is the first ever breakthrough agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan since the war of 2020. And hopefully it marks a return to diplomacy. For the Armenian government, I would say we're in a phase of accommodation to a new painful post-war reality. But looking forward, I do think negotiations are on track after a 2-day meeting in Kazakhstan. But what we're expecting and hoping for are reciprocal moves by both Azerbaijan and Armenia, where the time for unilateral concessions has passed.
So, Eugene, does this deal ensure that future conflicts will be avoided now?
I don't think we're quite there yet. Certainly, we've seen some signs of progress, but I don't think that until we reach a final deal, we can't rule out completely the possibility of future conflicts. Now, I think from the large-scale conflicts that we've seen over the past few years, those are probably behind us. You can't rule out small-scale skirmishes, especially if it's from non-state actors, so to speak. Hopefully, this will pave the way towards peace between the countries and broader economic connectivity. But as I mentioned before, there's still quite a number of political and even geopolitical challenges to come.
So, Richard, what do you make of the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Azerbaijan-Armenia border? I mean, is there any significance to it? And the question is, because there have been a lot of criticism, what do Armenians living in those areas fear the most?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, there is a very welcome development where Armenia is now reasserting its independence and sovereignty. And this is also involving addressing and tackling, if not overcoming, years of dangerous overdependence on Russia. And I do think we are now in a crisis in the relationship between Armenia and Russia, where Russia has proven to be not just unreliable, but unfriendly. The second part of your question, much of the local concern among Armenian villagers in the areas that were part of this recent agreement is really pronounced insecurity, where the proximity of Azerbaijani military units has only exacerbated the sense of insecurity. However, in the south, we still have Azerbaijani armed units on Armenian territory. Hopefully, when that aspect is resolved, we should expect a return to normalcy.
So, Eugene, once these 4 villages are returned to Azerbaijan, will the opening of the Zangezur corridor become a real possibility now? And if so, how would that add to the connectivity of the region?
Right. Well, I think that depends on the implementation of different elements of the agreement. I think that there's still quite a lot of opposition from the Armenian side and some of Armenia's Western friends. Just in terms of the nature of how the Zangezur corridor is implemented. Obviously, if it's done through forceful means, this is something that's going to face a lot of resistance. If it can be done as a result of negotiations proceeding, that will be, I think, welcomed by many parties, not all. I think Russia and Iran are 2 countries that are to watch for in terms of opposition to that type of corridor. But in general, I think that this really depends on the implementation of the negotiations and of the broader peace agreement in order for something like this corridor or really any type of major economic connectivity between the 2 countries to move forward.
So, Richard, Kazakhstan has recently hosted a meeting between the foreign ministers of both countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia. Has the country increased its profile as a neutral mediator after several attempts by Russia, Iran, the United States and Germany, as well as France, to reach a deal have failed?
That's a very good question, Ayse. We see the role of Kazakhstan, and actually in the words of the Kazakh leadership, not to be a mediator, but simply a facilitator. And I do think this was a one-time, one-off role for Kazakhstan, because the broader significance of the border agreement in April and last week's two-day meeting was this is now diplomacy without third parties. It's not and no longer in Brussels or Washington, and certainly not in Moscow. The border agreement was reached without the Russian presence, which was a further welcome development. But I wouldn't necessarily discount Kazakhstan because of its role in the broader restoration of regional trade and transport, connectivity, as Eugene was mentioning. But in terms of Armenian-Azerbaijani diplomacy, the real emphasis now is bringing the talks back home to the region, and it's directly on Azerbaijani terms with no third-party direct involvement.
But Eugene, although Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev is optimistic about a final peace deal with Armenia, he warned France, Greece and India about their continued armament of Armenia. And he said if it reached a critical level, he will not sit idle. So what would that critical level be? And do these countries deepening military cooperation with Armenia risk derailing this whole peace process?
I think it's certainly a factor to watch for, but given that Armenia is clearly trying to pivot away from, or at least supplement, its previous relationship with Russia, both on the security front, with Russia proving not to be, as Richard mentioned, necessarily a reliable partner, but also on the economic side of things. And so for Armenia, I think that the main thing is to make sure that its security is still intact, even despite Russia, being less of a factor nowadays, although still very much a regional player. So I think this is going to be a consideration in terms of how Armenia proceeds. On the one hand, it wants clearly, at least the Armenian government, to proceed with the peace agreement with Azerbaijan, but on the other hand, to maintain its security. So that will be a careful balance. I don't think countries like France or India will ever replace, the type of military guarantor, if you will, that Russia would. But it's something that Armenia still feels like the need to have as an option, but also as leverage in the ongoing talks.
So, Richard, it seems Armenia is trying to move away from Iran and Russia and forge closer ties with the West, maybe including Türkiye. So the question is, how would a peace deal between Baku and Yerevan impact the trajectory of Türkiye-Armenia relations moving forward?
Well, if we look specifically at the normalization of Armenia-Turkey relations, the Armenian government and specifically the Prime Minister remain committed. And in fact, Prime Minister Pashinyan went out of his way and attended President Erdogan's inauguration. But I do think Turkey cannot and will not do anything to undermine its relationship with Azerbaijan. Therefore, for the Turkish government, there is a need for some breakthrough with Armenia-Azerbaijan in order to justify Turkey moving ahead with fulfilling and implementing normalization. But I also think Armenia's diversification, its pivot westward, includes looking to Turkey.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Strait Talk.